Welcome to the Berkshires Gone By, history and folklore about the westernmost and most beautiful county in Massachusetts. I'm your host, Brooke. There are a surprising number of places that were once part of Massachusetts and aren't anymore, like Maine and New Hampshire, twice. But the last place to be split off was part of the Berkshires, and crime was the reason why. And one crime in particular that showed the great disregard for the laws of the rest of Massachusetts, and thumbed its nose too at New York. And by that I mean the great bare-knuckle boxing fight between Sullivan and Morrissey. Boston Corner, sometimes written as Boston Corners with an S, a small hamlet at the extreme southwestern corner of Berkshire County, part of the town of Mount Washington, Massachusetts, started as a farming community. It formed a sort of triangle with the state line of New York on two sides and the sharp edge of a great and long mountain the entire length of the other. There was only one road, decrepit at best, mostly unpassable in the off-seasons, that clung to the side of the mountain and came straight in from Massachusetts without crossing out of the state. The other road into the village came out of Massachusetts, but from further north, through a mountain pass, but it had to leave the state, crossing into New York, before re-entering into the village of Boston Corner, thus Massachusetts again. But the tiny village didn't know at its founding that this would make for a very profitable, if not shady, future. With time, it seemed, word got around to the right type of people that the law could be broken either over the mountain or just over the state line in New York, and the authorities had quite a hard time reaching the criminal for arrest. It was a triangular sort of haven, also nicknamed the Oblong. A close eye was kept on the single road over the mountain, and as it couldn't be taken at any great speed, word would quickly fly down to the village, and to every evildoer, until the perpetrator of a crime would hear about it, and walk leisurely over the line into New York State, where the Massachusetts law no longer applied, and an arrest could not be made. And, likewise, a home might be robbed just over in New York, and the burglar could waltz into Boston Corner, and was safe for the length of his stay. A popular activity for the underhanded in the village was to steal racehorses from Saratoga, and bring them down to be sold or raced at tracks near New York City. After, of course, they were dyed a different color so they wouldn't be recognized. The little hamlet of Boston Corner boomed, as well as a place with no real industry of its own could, and it earned the name of Hell's Acre. This thumbing of their noses finally culminated in one great event: the championship fight between James, nicknamed Yankee Sullivan, and John Morrissey. Boxing, you see, was illegal. This was before the era of boxing gloves. Real men didn't use gloves, and the violent and bloody nature of the sport prompted it to be banned. So, when it was decided that two of the most popular fighters should face one another, the protected Boston Corner was the perfect spot. All they had to do was warn the fighters that the fight would go ahead, so that they could prepare, and to spread the word so that fans knew where to come. The fighter most well known as Yankee Sullivan also used the names Frank Murray and James Sullivan, but was born James Ambrose. He was born on May 10th, 1811, in Bandon, County Cork, Ireland, but spent most of his childhood in London's East End. He couldn't keep out of trouble, though, and was sent to Australia, where he was forced to build roads. After 8 years, he was done serving his sentence and was set free, but almost right away he moved to Sydney and formed a gang called the Sydney Ducks, who were known to rob people with the help of straight razors. Sullivan had always been a good fighter, but this was where he honed his skills. Sailors were the best at fighting when confronted by muggers, and Sullivan became really good at beating them back. But he wanted to go back to England, and no captain would take him. Word had definitely gotten around. But he was able to hitch a ride to America, to New York City, where he wasn't as well known. But he would be. Almost right away he was in trouble. He was a promoter for a fight that resulted in the death of one of the fighters, so spent 2 years in prison. When he finally got out in the mid-1840s, he took up bar ownership when he bought the Sawdust House. But Sullivan couldn't keep away from what he knew. Before he even knew it, he was fighting again, and evading the constant pursuit of the police. It was hard to hold a fight, for what was a fight without spectators? But when word of event gets around, it was always likely to eventually reach the ear of the law, and they'd come looking to catch the culprits in the act. But Sullivan and the others, the other fighters, the other trainers, all the fans, they always seemed clever enough to stay one step ahead. Some even pretended to be the boxers themselves, so they would arrest the wrong person, and thus the real fighters would get away. After the cops hauled away the fraud, the real fight could go on. And as always, finding a secluded location was of the utmost importance. Even islands were used. John Morrissey was born February 12, 1831, and was also known by the nickname Old Smoke. He was a native of Templemore, County Tipperary, Ireland. He made his way to the U.S. when his family immigrated to Troy, New York in 1833. His family was desperately poor, and this drove him to begin breaking the law to keep them afloat while he was still very young. He'd begun by stealing unguarded cargo, and when he was big enough, worked collecting money for an Irish mob. He was arrested for a long list of crimes before even becoming a legal adult. And he was a ferocious and fearless fighter. He began his first real job as a bouncer at a brothel. And while he was there, trying to stay out of real trouble, he began to study hard, teaching himself to read and write as well as anything else encapsulated in any book he could get his hands on. He may have spent his time growing up in the slums, but he'd be damned if he was going to stay there. He'd be arrested for something small, spend a few months in jail, and when set free, seeing no reason to stay, Morrissey left Troy and traveled to the Big Apple. His reputation as a real bare-knuckle fighter began after he was beaten by a man named Kroll. Kroll was a scoundrel to everyone who knew him, and the entire neighborhood wished someone would show him who was the boss. That person, that day, would not be young Morrissey. But the kid fought with such courage and determination that he won the respect of everyone there. His nickname, Old Smoke, came from a personal battle with a fellow gang member, a man named Tom McCann. During their fight, a stove had been knocked over, and McCann had thrown Morrissey down on his back upon the burning embers, and was keeping him from getting back up. Morrissey, still laying down, was able to beat McCann back before he hopped to his feet. The badly burned flesh of his back smoked as he pummeled McCann into unconsciousness. He soon went out west to search for gold during the gold rush. He didn't strike it rich the normal way, but he did win an awful lot of money from people who did, by beating them at gambling. It was out west that he also fought for the first time for money and won a tidy $5,000. He decided then to head back to New York City, where he bought a bar on Lower Broadway that he'd name the Gem, and then he challenged the champion to a fight. Some guy called Yankee Sullivan. It took a little pestering, but Sullivan finally agreed to fight Morrissey. Then they had to think of a spot for the event, and it was agreed. The perfect place was the little hamlet of Boston Corner, Massachusetts. So the word was spread, and the men got ready. The fight was scheduled for the 12th of October, 1853, and it was a highly anticipated event. More than 3,000 people showed up. Some guessed it was actually as many as 5,000. The village at the time only had 150 residents, but it was suddenly overwhelmed by horses, buggies, carriages, and the baggage of all the people showing up to the tiny rail station. There definitely were not enough rooms at the little boarding house, or inn. A ring was set up in a field beside an old brickyard. The rules were simple. No hitting or grabbing below the belt. Each round went until a man either fell down or one of his knees touched the ground. And if a man couldn't continue after a count of 30, it was done. The prize would be $2,000, and 20 or 30 rounds was the normal length for a bout. Sullivan was a healthy 40 years old. He weighed about 145 pounds. Morrissey was only 22, and at 175 pounds, outweighed his older counterpart. He also stood at an impressive 6'2", unusually tall for the time. The crowd gathered around and cheered as each fighter made his way to the ring. They stood toe-to-toe, and then the match began. For swing after swing, Sullivan consistently outpowered Morrissey, beating him back for quite a while. But Morrissey kept taking the punches, or tried to avoid them, but he didn't avoid enough of them, however, to save his face, which began to swell, discolor, and bleed. But still, he didn't give up. An entire hour passed, an hour of bruises and beatings, of bloody noses and fat lips. Morrissey slowly took control, battling Sullivan back as hard as he had him in the earlier rounds. Near the end, they were just wildly throwing their fists against each other, almost too swollen around the eyes to see. And then, Sullivan broke the rules. Morrissey had fallen to his knees, but before he could get back up, Sullivan slugged him one, knocking him cold. A different story casts Sullivan in a slightly better light, claiming that Sullivan had been in the heat of battle when he saw a friend in the audience receive a punch in the face from another attendee. Outraged, this story says that Sullivan jumped out of the ring to defend him. Either way, what is known is that the fans erupted with fury. The sport might have been an outlawed spectacle of barbaric brutality, but they'd be damned if a fighter tried to break the rules. They began to hop over the ropes and into the ring, confronting Sullivan and the referee. Some tried to revive the battered Morrissey. The crowd was so loud, and so many other smaller fights had broken out that no one could hear anything, and for a while, Sullivan basked in what he thought was his glory, believing he'd won. But after shouting himself hoarse, the referee was finally able to quiet them down, and announced his decision. Over the mumblings and disapproval of Sullivan's actions, the ref declared Morrissey the winner by a disqualification. He was now the American champion, and was awarded the prize money. It had taken 37 rounds for the fight to come to an end. Sullivan was understandably unhappy. But as the fans fled, you see, the police had finally arrived. So did Sullivan. But Morrissey wasn't fast enough. The cops nabbed him and threw him into jail at Lenox. After a brief trial, he had to pay a fine of $1,200. But that didn't matter to him. He still had the remaining prize money, which in those days was quite a big sum. And, more importantly, the title. Sullivan and Morrissey returned to their normal lives. And were their lives ever different? Sullivan moved all the way across the country to California, where he took a job guarding ballot boxes from anyone who might cast a vote against his employer, a position called a shoulder hitter, and definitely a position for a low-life thug. But it turns out that Sullivan was guarding a ballot box that would result in the election of a man whose name was not only not even on the ballot, but also a man who would end up a murderer. The murder resulted in Sullivan's being arrested in connection with the criminal and sentenced to deportation. But before he could be shipped back to Ireland, he was found in his cell, having cut his wrist, or, again casting him in the role of the victim. Another story claims that he was hanged by a group of vigilantes. It seems that the differing stories may have been the result of his loyal fans, who didn't want him to be remembered as just a criminal. Either way, he was already dead, and there was a persistent rumor that people involved with the mob and the corrupt politicians he'd worked for had ended his life in an attempt to stop him from divulging any secrets that he might have thought would keep the government from sending him back overseas. He was carted out of the holding cell and buried near the corner of 16th and Dolores Streets in San Francisco, in the Mission Dolores Cemetery. At first, there was no marker at all, but 2 years later, a man named Tom Malloy paid for one to be erected. It reads, "Remember not, O Lord, our offenses, nor those of our parents. Neither take thou vengeance of our sins. Thou shalt bring forth my soul out of tribulation, and in thy mercy thou shalt destroy mine enemies." Much the opposite was the path of Morrissey's life. After the fight, he quickly found his way into politics. The self-taught, brilliant young man found himself in the Democratic fold of New York City. He made some powerful friends after he and his gang, called the Dead Rabbits, stopped the theft of ballot boxes and thus the rigging of an election by the leader of the Bowery Boys, an enforcer for the Know-Nothing Party and a boxer known as William "Bill the Butcher" Poole and his gang. Morrissey was allowed to open an illegal gambling den with no police interference as means of thanks from Tammany Hall. Somewhere along the line, Morrissey also got married, but he couldn't seem to avoid Bill the Butcher. Morrissey and Bill the Butcher essentially did the same job for two different opposing operations, thus became bitter rivals. Every time they met, it seemed trouble wasn't far behind. Bill the Butcher would end up shooting and killing one of Morrissey's friends. It was time for Bill and Morrissey to have a real man-to-man match. On July 28th of 1854, the New York City Daily Times said that Bill the Butcher showed up for a fight in a rowboat. You see, the fight was in the early morning and on a pier, and after only the first minute, Bill had Morrissey pinned on his back for a full 5 minutes before Morrissey finally called the fight off. Bill rowed away on his boat again, and Morrissey, with his 12 gang members, were left in the midst of a few hundred of Bill the Butcher's supporters. A massive battle erupted, leaving Morrissey and his men limping away. But Bill the Butcher wouldn't escape the cops forever. Eventually they'd catch him for the murder, but 3 trials would fail to find him guilty. He too had a lot of friends in high places. Morrissey and his wife moved back to Troy, New York. They couldn't seem to make enough money, so he found himself in Canada, fighting again, where he knocked out John Heenan and claimed the title and the prize money. The next year, in 1859, he'd retire, and Heenan would claim the title back by default. He decided to start a gambling house in a place already well known for racing, Saratoga Springs, New York. And after the rapid growth of that venture was obvious, he expanded again, improving upon what was already popular in the area by building the Saratoga Racecourse for racing horses, a true and professional venue for the sport of kings. And again, expand with the addition of the Clubhouse Casino, a playground for the rich and notable of the era. But he wasn't done. Soon he had holdings in 16 different gambling establishments, and his old pals at Tammany Hall backed him all the way. Even when he decided to run for Congress, he won and served 2 terms from 1867 to 1871. And from his new place of power, he always kept an eye out for the little guy. And by that, I mean the Irish. Sometimes he'd even threaten a boxer-style punch or two when he argued with other congressmen. But even he couldn't stand the slippery dealings of Tammany Hall forever, and despite all their help, he eventually did an about-face and testified against Mr. William Tweed, Boss Tweed, the head of Tammany Hall himself, which ensured Tweed's sentencing to prison. But even this couldn't keep Morrissey down, and despite sending one of the biggest names, if not the biggest name, in New York corruption to prison, Morrissey found himself being elected to the New York State Senate as an anti-Tammany Democrat for 2 years. The man who taught himself to read and never had any formal education was living a life of wealth, respect, and power. But the good times couldn't last forever. While campaigning for a potential second term, sickness overwhelmed him. The election was his, but he'd not lived to serve any of the term. He died in Saratoga Springs while staying at the Adelphi Hotel on the 1st of May. And when his body was returned to Troy, New York, a gathering of about 12,000 people came to the funeral to see him off. Both Sullivan and Morrissey's fights, adventures, and life stories were recorded and perhaps over-dramatized, slightly, in dime novels of the time. This might seem like the end of Sullivan and Morrissey's stories, but it's not the end of the story. You see, they had another lasting legacy. Back just after the fight between the two, New York, Massachusetts, and the people of Boston Corner as well as other nearby communities, had had enough. Something had to be done to ensure that this corner of Massachusetts was no longer out of the reach of the law, and after a few years of petitions, plans, and meetings about potential border changes, in 1855 the state line was shifted to run along the crest of the mountain, which officially made Boston Corner part of New York State, no longer part of Berkshire County. The criminal activity dried up in a hurry, and the population dwindled back down to those who meant to make their living through the honest working of the land. Now, it's a sunny, sleepy place, abundant with nature. There are still hints of its past present, if you want to go looking for them. The field where the fight was held is still there, now marked by a sign that points out its significance. The date of the sign was printed into the metal wrong, but somebody fixed it with a little paint. The old surveyor's stone that used to denote the location of the original corner of the state is still out there in the woods, but it doesn't mean anything to most people anymore. The old road over the mountain, from the Berkshires, is just a ghostly overgrown line of what once was, zigzagging down the steep mountainside from above. This has been The Berkshires Gone By, created, written, directed, and read by myself, Brooke Renier, and co-produced by Deanna Garner. If you'd like to contact us, find more episodes, or see images relating to our topics, please visit our page on Facebook, or visit our new website at www.theberkshiresgoneby.com. You can also email us at theberkshiresgoneby, all one word, at gmail.com. We hope you'll join us for our next episode. Thanks for listening.